So this is a classic 1440p gaming monitor, 27-inch diagonal, a fast IPS panel clocked at 180Hz. Can't really go wrong with these specs. But this is also a very crowded segment with lots of competition, so it's gonna be interesting to see how the Asus XG27ACS stacks up. It's definitely not easy to offer something fresh and unique in this segment. So Asus have this phone holder now integrated into the stand, which is something new, I guess. And then there is this 1/4-inch mount at the top of the stand, which is actually kind of useful, I have to say. Of course, you could use it to mount a camera or lights if you're a streamer, but it's also a good spot to mount a bias light, to get some light behind the monitor and reduce eye strain. I'm using a small video light, and it gets its power through USB-C directly from the monitor. It automatically turns on and off with the monitor, so that's pretty nice actually. Apart from that, this is just like a typical mid-range gaming monitor. Black plastics, red accents, really nothing special. But the ergonomics are good. Height, tilt, swivel, and pivot are adjustable. I wish it would go a bit higher, but you can always get an aftermarket stand. Now, let's talk about the display itself. It's your classic 27-inch 1440p IPS panel. Matte coating, no mini LED, no local dimming, just like virtually every other monitor in this segment. But this panel is actually pretty fast, and I have to say that Asus really did a good job with the implementation and tuning. The OSD actually gives us a slider for the overdrive, which is great to see and much better than the 3 or 4 predefined settings we typically get with other monitors. So there's plenty modes to choose from, and you can really fine-tune the overdrive to your liking. The default level 10 looks pretty good already, but it's slightly too strong, showing a bit of inverse ghosting. I found level 9 to be pretty much perfect. That's a 4.3 milliseconds response time average with minimal overshoot, which makes the XG27ACS one of the fastest IPS monitor that's currently on the market. That's pretty much as fast as it gets for an IPS panel. And the performance is consistent throughout the refresh rate range. So this is a true single overdrive mode experience. The overdrive setting works slightly different though when adaptive sync is turned off. Here OD8 is the best mode and gives us similar results. So how does the XG27ACS stack up against other monitors? Well, side by side the Asus looks better than the Dell G2724D, but it's also worth noting that the Dell typically is less expensive. Still, the Asus has less ghosting, and the slightly higher refresh rate also helps making the UFOs look a bit sharper. Similar story against the AW2724DM. This one also clocks at 180Hz, just like the Asus, but the Asus still looks better thanks to its faster response times. The Dell and Alienware by no means look bad, but the XG27ACS has the better motion performance. This is really an excellent performance for this class. For some context, here's what a 240Hz OLED looks like in comparison. Now Asus also implemented Backlight Strobing, which they call eLMB. And the XG27ACS even supports eLMB Sync, so backlight strobing with adaptive sync. Unfortunately, the eLMB sync mode doesn't look all that great with lots of crosstalk, and it's not even that sharp. I much prefer the standard eLMB mode, which actually looks pretty decent. 5 levels are available, and level 3, I'd say, is the sweet spot. The higher levels are even sharper, but rather dim, where the lower levels aren't worth it as they lack motion sharpness. Now, apart from the faint red halo, this looks pretty good. The red halo is a side effect of the red phosphor that's being used in this panel, so that's hard to avoid. But apart from that, Asus did a great job tuning this mode. There's basically no crosstalk mid-screen, and the top and the bottom of the screen look acceptable too. Not bad for a monitor of this class. And that shows when you compare it to some of the best backlight strobing monitors out there. Of course, it can't keep up with something like the Zowie XL2586X, which is a much more expensive esports monitor with a big focus on backlight strobing. But the XG27ACS really doesn't look too bad in terms of motion clarity and brightness. Now, Asus also did a good job keeping the latency low. Mid-screen, this monitor only measures 2.8 milliseconds of total display lag, which actually is the theoretical limit for a 180Hz display, so it doesn't get faster than this. And that's also consistent with adaptive sync turned on or off. Now, speaking of adaptive sync, NVIDIA certified this monitor as G-Sync compatible, which typically is a good sign. And indeed, the adaptive sync performance is flawless. No flickering or stuttering in my testing. At roughly 56 FPS, the low frame rate compensation kicks in, and even at this critical transition point, the performance is great. If you look super closely, you can see how the monitor switches overdrive modes when it doubles the refresh rate, which is super typical for monitors that use variable overdrive, but it's really hard to spot here. Okay, let's shift gears a little and talk about the image quality in general. First up, the brightness. At the lowest setting, the brightness goes down to just 37 nits, which is great for using this monitor in a dark room. And on the top end, the brightness almost hits 400 nits, which should be enough for most rooms. What's slightly disappointing though is the contrast ratio. It's roughly 10% below the typical 1000:1 we'd expect from an IPS panel. That's not to say it looks noticeably worse than other IPS panels, at least not without a direct side-by-side comparison, but a better contrast ratio wouldn't hurt either. And that's especially true when it comes to HDR content. Yes, this monitor does support HDR, so you can stream HDR videos or enable HDR on your games, but there's no real benefit to it, as the contrast and brightness are just not good enough for the real HDR experience. There's no local dimming, and the screen only gets marginally brighter in HDR, reaching 413 nits. Honestly, wouldn't even bother turning on the HDR mode and just stick to SDR. Now, the color saturation on the XG27ACS is in line with most LCDs in the segment. It achieves about 1.3 times the gamut volume of sRGB. So colors are vivid, but sRGB content does look a bit oversaturated. But the gamut volume is a bit too small to cover the large Adobe RGB color space. But P3 content looks decent with about 90% coverage. And with the default settings, the color accuracy is actually surprisingly good. Even the white point is almost spot on, which is something you don't see often. Now, this is the color accuracy with display P3 content. sRGB material will of course look oversaturated with default settings. However, Asus even implemented an option to select either sRGB or P3 as the color gamut in the OSD, in addition to the unclamped white gamut mode. That's definitely a welcomed option. The DCI P3 mode, unfortunately, is much less accurate for P3 content than the white gamut mode, as it's messing with the white point. Selecting sRGB as the color space improves color accuracy, but here the white point still is off for some reason. But Asus also implemented a dedicated sRGB mode in addition to the sRGB gamut setting. Don't ask me why. But yeah, this sRGB mode is actually very accurate. Downside being that this mode disables like half the settings in the menu, which really is a shame. I'd actually recommend using different settings for sRGB that we'll cover in a second. With these settings, we get a super accurate sRGB representation. And of course, after full calibration and profiling, we get excellent color accuracy. Now, if you don't have access to a colorimeter, these are the settings I'd recommend using. For the unclaimed color gamut, I'd actually recommend just using the default racing mode, which is surprisingly accurate out of the box, but I'd still suggest applying the ICC profile on top of that to improve the color accuracy even further in applications that support color management. I put a download link in the video description. Alternatively, the settings on the right work great for sRGB content too, without needing to load an ICC profile. Please don't use the ICC profile if you want to use the settings on the right. So is the XG27ACS even worth getting? I mean, this typically is not the most affordable monitor with these specs. You can often get a monitor with similar specs in the low $200 to $250 price range. And this one currently goes for just below $300 US. I got international links down below if you want to check the current pricing in your region. But I have to say, Asus really did a good job with this monitor, so a small price premium might be justified. The out-of-the-box color accuracy is among the best I've seen so far. The sRGB mode is really good too, and the response times are top tier as well. We're not talking about huge differences here, but this is just a really well-tuned monitor. The somewhat low contrast ratio is one of the very few weak points of this monitor. On the plus side, you get a true single overdrive mode experience, and even a usable backlight strobing mode, which is pretty rare in the segment. If you value these things and want a monitor that's just a tad bit more refined, then this is a good option. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.